So now let's see how a variable will kind of behave in a variable environment. So let's click on a blank area and introduce again a matrix variable. And again, similarly as we did here, we're going to have symbol and year. Okay, so we have different years for different stocks in this variable. Okay, so the previous variable is with regard to a calculate column called asset EOY underscore C. Okay, so here in this variable we're going to use instead the mirror asset EOY underscore M. So I'm going to put it here as the value. Alright, so you can see the definition of mirror will be dependent. Okay, how mirror actually take values to do the calculation actually depends on the future context, because mirror, as we have seen, does not exist in a in a data table. Okay, it's not part of the data table. You go to the table view, you will not see this mirror. Okay, you will not see this mirror there. Okay, mirror exists in a variable environment. So this mirror, once it's put into this variable, it's gonna have life, put it that way. Okay. However, the value of the mirror will be dependent on the future context. Again, future context is kind of relevant in a variable. Okay, so in a variable we talk about future context here, and in here when we're looking at this row, we're talking about year 2022 regarding Apple. Okay, so this is the future context this mirror is going to use to do the calculation. All right, let's go check the mirror's definition. Again, it's gonna first use the index function to take the last position out of the current partition. All right, the last row in the current partition. Then use the min-x function and take this last row and just find the value of assets of this last row and take it. All right, assuming this last row is one single row, then there's no calculation regarding the minimum calculation, right? We just have one row, one assets field, then there's no minimum. The minimum is just itself. Okay, however, if this last row is a block of rows, several rows, then this min-x function is going to work on this block of rows, find assets value for each row. Okay, and then take the minimum value of assets out of the all the rows in this last row variable. Okay, in this variable. So assuming this variable is taking a block of rows, okay, then we're going to take the minimum value of assets across all the rows contained in this what we call the last row variable. Okay, so here let's see how this mirror works in this variable environment. Excuse me. So once we are first, let's focus on this row, this particular row. This row is related to Apple in year 2022. So that's gonna be a filter imposed on the original data. Okay, example table. So index is gonna work on this table because this table is part of the index function. Okay, it basically tells Power BI this is a table the index function is gonna work on. Okay. However, because of this variable, we have additional filter context we need to consider. And this filter is regarding Apple in year 2022. So this filter is going to be imposed on this data table first. And the index function is only going to work on the filtered data after we imposing this filter context. Excuse me. So what does that mean? Let's again go back to this original file, Excel file, which maybe give a better idea about what the data would look like after the filter context is being applied. All right. So we're going to look at Apple in year 2022. Okay. So because of the variable, the current row here, this row is only going to utilize data related to Apple in year 2022. So basically those four rows is going to be the relevant data the index function is going to work on. Okay. So based on this block of rows, the index function is going to determine what's the current partition. All right. The partition, as we have seen before, defines symbol together with year, these two data fields will determine a partition. So for a certain stock in a certain year, okay, each partition is regarding a certain stock in a certain year, basically. All right. So here, this filter context basically says, well, Power BI index function, please, now you are going to work on this 4 rows only. Okay, that's the data after we apply the filter context. Okay, so this is data the index function is going to work on. All right. So now please consider what's the current partition based on this filter context. So this filter context apparently tells you, okay, it's very clear. The apple is a symbol. Year is only regarding year 2022. So the current partition is pretty much determined. It's related to apple in year 2022. Okay. Once the current partition is determined, the index function is going to take the last one. -1 means the last row in this current partition. So since these 4 rows basically represents the current partition, okay, related to apple in year 2022, the last row of this partition is going to be row 5. Okay, this row. All right. So this last row variable is going to be just taking this single row, row 5. All right, that's a value for that variable last row. Okay, the entire row 5 is going to be the value for this variable called last row. So then the minimum function is going to work on this last row, row 5, and take the value of assets. Again, because we just have one single row, there's one single value for this assets field, then there's no minimum at all. The minimum is just itself. Okay, so we're going to take the assets value from row 5, which is going to be 33. Okay, and you can see here, 33 is shown here. So that's basically, you know, how the logic by which Power BI can eventually figure out which value should be shown in this cell. Okay, so let's work on another cell. If we're looking at this row regarding Apple in year 2023, again, this is going to be a filter context determined by what stock you're looking at, which year you're looking at. Okay, in this video. So we're working on Apple in year 2023. That will determine the filter context. So the Power BI is only going to look at those 4 rows related to Apple in year 2023. Okay, based on the filter context. And again, the index function is gonna work after the data has been filtered. Okay, so now the index function is going to take a look at the current data we're working on, these 4 rows basically, then determine what's the current partition. Apparently, again, the partition is determined by a combination of stock symbol and the year. So the current 4 rows has a clear defined partition. We're working on Apple in year 2023. So the current partition is determined. Apple year 2023, that's the current partition. So within the current partition, the index function is going to take the last row from this current partition, which is row 9, basically. Okay, then the min x function is going to work on this last row of the current partition and take the minimum value of assets. So because we're just working on one row, row 9, assets field just have one value, 32. Okay, so this value is going to be taken. It's equivalent to the minimum of it. Okay, so this 32 is going to be given. It's going to be taken and output here as the value for this cell. Okay, so that's how the filter context work with a mirror to show the relevant value in this matrix view. Now let's take a look at this row, the very first row regarding Apple. All right. For this row, how the mirror is going to work and show this number 32. Okay, so when we have a filter only with respect to the stock symbol, okay, well, now the filter is just Apple. That's a filter context. Remember, in this visual environment, that's a filter context. We're only looking at data related to Apple. So that means Power BI is only going to take a look at this block of rows related to Apple. There's no other rows related to Apple in this table. Okay, so this is gonna be the block of rows the index function gonna work on. Okay. The index function again is gonna take the last row from the current partition. So the first thing index function need to determine is what is the current partition based on the future context. A partition again is determined by a combination of symbol and year. So here, this block of rows, 8 rows in total, do not just have one partition. Okay, it's related to Apple, but there's 2 different years, year 2022 and year 2023. So there's actually 2 partitions involved in this block of rows. There's no single partition. So how can index tell what's the current partition, right? There's actually 2 current partitions in this case, okay? Which actually you should avoid, okay? You should have a variable which shows numbers, but those numbers need to be clearly defined, okay? Especially when you use the index function. When we talk about the current partition, that current partition should be a single partition, okay? Of course, you can work around multiple partitions, as I will show you here. However, it's gonna give you a lot of confusion when you look at the variable. Okay, try to understand how the numbers actually work. All right. So for now, the current partition actually involves 2 partitions. Apple year 2022, that's the first partition. The other is Apple 2023. Okay. So basically, the index function is gonna take the last row from first partition, and it's also going to take the last row from the second partition and put them together. All right. So the index function is going to basically return 2 rows. The first row is the last row in the first partition related to Apple in year 2022. The second row is going to be the last row related to the second partition, which is Apple in year 2023. Okay. So that said, the last row, okay, the last row variable here, or basically this index function is going to return 2 rows. Row number 5, okay, row number 5 related to Apple in year 2022. The last row for Apple in year 2022, that's row number 5. The second row in this last row variable is going to be row number 9 related to Apple at the end of year 2023. Okay, so that's these 2 rows are what the index function is going to return to you. Okay, so then this definition, this variable v, which uses min x to scan this last row variable. Remember, now the last row has 2 rows. Okay, I will show the last row basically contains row 5 and row 9. Okay, the last row variable now contains 2 rows. And this min x function is going to scan these 2 rows. For each row, it's going to calculate the value for assets and then take the minimum out of these 2 values. All right. So assets in the first row equals 33, in the second row equals 32. Okay. So both values are going to be scanned by the min x function, and that min x function is going to determine which value is the smallest, the minimum, then take that value as the output. So basically, among 33 and 32, 32 is the minimum. All right. So that's why you see for this row regarding Apple in general without a specific year. So in this case, we're considering both year 2022 and year 2023. In this case, the output for this measure is going to be 32, as we just described. Okay. So this is how the measure works with the future context in a variable to output the right number for you. Okay. The other rows, they work very similarly. Okay. Let's just work through one of them. For example, the Honda year 2021. Okay. So in this case, again, this measure is gonna look at the example table. Okay, this data table called example table. All right. Look at this table and take the current future context. Apply the current future context. Okay. If the current future context is regarding Honda in 2021, so then Power BI is only going to look at this 4 rows. That's gonna be the future context index function is gonna work at. Okay, it's gonna work on this 4 rows, and the index function is gonna take the last row out of the current partition. And again, because index function already defined partition based on stock symbol and year, and the current 4 rows is related to Honda in year 2021. So basically the current partition is going to be related to Honda in year 2021. Okay, so basically all the 4 rows is the current partition related to Honda in year 2021. Then the index function is going to take the very last row out of this current partition, which is going to be this row related to the 4th quarter of year 2021. So for that row, the asset value is 47. Okay, so that's why you see here 47 is shown here. All right. Regarding this row, okay, if we're looking at this row, how Power BI determines this output should be 46? Because for this row, the future context is regarding Honda in general without specific years shown here as a future. So we're only going to work on all the data related to Honda. So what's going to be the data related to Honda? Those 8 rows together is going to be the block of rows related to Honda only. So that's a future context we're working on now. Okay. So out of this 8 rows, there's going to be 2 partitions. Again, a partition is determined by a combination of stock symbol and year. So this 8 rows has actually 2 partitions. One partition is related to Honda in year 2021. The other is going to be Honda in year 2022. So there's 2 partitions. Okay. So index function is going to take the last row out of the current partition, because now the current partition actually has 2 different partitions. Okay. So index function was forced to work on 2 partitions, and for the first partition, Honda year 2021 is going to take the last row out of this first partition, which is going to be row 21. Okay, this is going to be the last row of the first partition. For the second partition, Honda year 2022, the last row is going to be this row 25. Okay, so that's going to be the two rows the index function is going to return. And these 2 rows are going to be returned and stored in this variable called last row. So this variable last row contains 2 rows. Then the min_x function is going to work on these 2 rows, scan these 2 rows, find the value of assets in these 2 rows, which means the min_x function is going to look at 47 and 46. Those are the value for this assets field in these 2 rows. Then the min_x function is going to compare these 2 values and take the minimum out of it. Okay, so the minimum is going to be 46, of course. So that's why here you see 46 related to this Honda row. Okay, so that's a few examples regarding how Mirror is going to find its output value dependent on the future context in a viewer.